We are witnessing the largest reallocation of public capital in Europe since the end of the Cold War. And in the face of aggression, we are rebuilding our defenses. And from a traditional security perspective, that makes a lot of sense. We are seeing the Russian invasion of Ukraine, which has sparked a lot of the defense reallocations and investments. We're seeing threats against European countries. We're seeing incursions into European airspace, as well as hybrid attacks. So let's be real, the threats are real, the security issues are there. But from a strategic and societal economic perspective, I would argue, I'm not an economist, but I would still argue from an economic perspective, I would argue that we're making a fundamental error because we treat defense and climate as competing line items. And I think that is where we must change our approach. We assume that at the moment the security threat of Russia and the security threat to Europe is so severe that climate change doesn't matter. Now, as I said, the threat is real, but at the same time, I'm a researcher in the Climate Change and Risk Program at CIPRI in Stockholm. I've been studying climate change and environmental security issues for the last 17 years. The security implications of climate change are also real. So my argument today is very simple, that we don't have the luxury to wait to first have a separation where we first focus on the defense side and then we focus on the climate side. I would argue that is strategic fiction. Because in the 21st century, a defense strategy cannot be built on the assumptions of the 20th century. Ignoring climate change means we are not building security, and the research is backing that up. Instead, what we're doing with this investment, if we're ignoring climate change, is we're creating stranded assets, we're building a fortress on quicksand, and in the end, what we are actually doing by our attempts to invest to making us more secure is actually we're leaving societies less secure. So as I said, the security reality in the age of climate change is actually about wider security implications, right? It's not just about the military threats, but it's much wider. But it also, and that is a factor that me and my team, we're working primarily in the context of fragile conflict-affected states. We see that everywhere, right? We see that in those countries, how climate change is compounding the hardship and insecurity of people. But it is also about European security and European defense capabilities, because climate change is changing the security landscape. And the key examples here, maybe just to go through a few from the research side, we can start looking at the Arctic, very popular with Greenland at the moment. But aside from that question, we see how melting permafrost is actually destabilizing critical infrastructure, like the runways as well as early warning radar stations, that our early warning, obviously, in the Arctic is dependent on, but just to add a nuclear dimension to that, it's also what our nuclear deterrence and nuclear warning systems are related to. So it's no surprise that the Biden administration in 2024, in its defense budget request, proposed $5.1 billion in funding for, quote, enhancing combat capabilities and mitigating climate risks. So it's about the Arctic, but it's not just about the Arctic, it's about getting the military ready for a changing 20th century world. We see the other impacts that melting glaciers, especially in the Arctic, but overall that the changing salinity through that, because that is fresh water, is actually changing the sonar read capabilities of submarines and of detecting of submarines. So it has a direct implication on anti-submarine warfare. I'm also not a nuclear security expert, but I think if there's one domain where we do not want uncertainty, it's probably in the nuclear security field. The other examples we can relate more in the area of heat. We see that aircraft have a difficulty of taking off. The lift of aircraft, their capacity to lift off, is inhibited by extreme heat. It impacts equipment durability. We have problems that some of the ships, actually of the US, are not able to cool nuclear reactors that are propelling them to the same degree because the temperatures of the water are too hot in some of the regions in the Gulf. And we see also how the extreme heat is actually impacting soldiers very directly, impacting training schedules, impacting their ability to perform because of the changing and more frequent and more severe environment. And that is also a factor that we experience probably from the civilian side a few times in our interactions with the military in the face of natural disasters. Look at the floods in Spain and Poland in 2024, where tens of thousands of troops were diverted from defense readiness to disaster relief. We have seen similar examples and similar deployments in Germany. We have seen it last year in Switzerland, and I'm pretty confident, without knowing the details, that we are also seeing this in Austria. It's a constant reality. The problem is that when a fighter jet cannot take off because the runway is broken, because permafrost melted the infrastructure or destroyed the infrastructure, it's not an environmental issue. I mean, it's also an environmental issue, but it's a loss of defense capability. When a radar system isn't able to, is collapsing and breaking down, it is a security failure, right? So that is just to illustrate that these are, I mean, climate change is not just about climate. It's actually having a direct impact already today on military capabilities. And that, I think, is where we see the biggest disconnect. And despite these physical realities, our financial planning is quite incoherent. A recent paper by the European Central Bank suggested that Europe needs to mobilize an additional investment ranging from 2.7 to 3.7% of European GDP each year until 2030 to effectively achieve the green transition. So take that as a counterpoint to the 5% target for NATO or the 3.5% GDP explicitly on defense and the 1.5% within there on wider security and resilience building measures. As was pointed out, for defense, it seems the political will is there and the money is there. Meanwhile, we struggle to mobilize the resources for the green transition, even though we see that climate change is actually undermining our security and our defense capabilities in the long run. As I said, I'm not an economist, but to me, that sounds like a flawed hedging strategy. So one of the questions of the discussion on the announcement was, is climate policy peace policy? And for me, working at a peace research institute, looking at climate change and security issues, the answer is absolutely yes. But only if we are considering climate resilience as a prerequisite for defense capabilities and defense efficacy, if we have integrated security, where national security, societal security, and ecological security are all taken into account. That's why we need to change our investments, and I think that was also already touched upon now, the look at dual use or dual capabilities and the investments, which would be one of my pleas, that we start looking more into that area where we must direct defense spending towards innovation and technologies that serve both security and climate goals. Examples are decentralized renewable energy grids that make military bases more resilient, harder to knock out. We see that in the case of Ukraine, but also more broadly in deployment in peacekeeping. But of course, decentralized microgrids, battery storage, all of that has civilian application that is relevant in so many other cases, and it provides a real security dividend. And we see another example where Spain is actually already doing this, where the Spanish government has earmarked 1.75 billion of its growing military budget in line with the NATO discussions on climate-responsive dual-use capabilities that explicitly are designed to tackle climate-related emergencies. I think that is smart capital allocation. The other part is we need political harmonization. In Sweden, the government has recently blocked 13 wind power farms in the Baltic Sea because they interfered with radar and air defense capabilities. Now, in this case, that was actually true, and that is actually a real issue that was needed to be taken into account. But of course, we solved one security issue by not solving another one. Even though if we start thinking about these things together, we see that innovation in the space is actually possible, and other countries are already doing that, which actually enhances our air defense capabilities if we build and think those things together. The last point here is the geopolitical reality, and this is maybe where things get a little bit cynical, because if we are honest about it, the current threat landscape and actors like Russia are actively undermining the green transition in Europe through disinformation. Quote, NATO report last year. So why is it doing it? Because fossil fuel dependency makes Europe more vulnerable. So every day we delay the transition is a day we remain strategically exposed. And so green energy is not just about carbon emissions, it's about autonomy, it's about our security. So in conclusion, in a world increasingly shaped by climate change, the enemy is not just a state actor. Climate change is an actorless threat. And it's an enemy that is destabilizing our planetary system and that our societies and our economies actually depend upon. If the narrative remains, first we secure our defense capabilities, then we save the planet, we will fail with both. And from an investment strategy, I would say that would mean that we can't accept defense strategies that lack climate resilience in their strategies. They are one and the same thing. And if your defense investment isn't climate-proofed, it's a bad investment. If your climate investment doesn't account for security, it's naive. Thank you.
Both climate and defense or security are public goods. Florian, do you have an opinion on this?
Yeah, no, thank you very much. I think, I mean, I'm not an expert on Eurobonds, but sounds like a really, really brilliant idea. And I think the key part here is simply if we don't, we're going to fail. Like if we don't start to finding the synergies and addressing those things together, and I would say welfare needs to be part of that, because otherwise we see all the grievances that are going to come up and that are going to be exploited in our democracies. That are creating a whole other threat again, right? And make us again vulnerable to hybrid attacks from other actors. So we need to capture all of those things together. We need to fight the, and maybe we're getting into a conflict there, but the taxonomy, I mean, that's good. But of course, from a societal perspective, like, right, some things are hard to just put in one category. Like it is in multiple categories by design, and we often, I see that specifically on the climate investment in fragile states, right, where it's like, well, that can only be climate adaptation, that cannot be development aid, and that cannot be peace building funding. And you're like, how is that in the case of Somalia not, right? I mean, those things need to go together. On the AMOC, I think, is Europe preparing? The interesting, I mean, if I want to be snarky, I'm like, for what? Right? It's like for collapse. That means, okay, we're entering a new ice age. That's going to be one side of investment. Or maybe that's not going to happen, and it's just a slowdown, and it's going to take really long. It's like, so that's a whole different set of investment, because that's a warming Europe, and probably soon in Uppsala I'm gonna be able to plant wine nicely and export it. But so what are you, from a military perspective, preparing for? Like for new icebreakers because we're entering the ice age, or for heat adaptation because, well, it's going to be really hot and we're seeing more wildfires, etc. I think it's taken into account by some military planning units. I know we've worked with the Swedish Defense forces on some of that. I know there's some discussions going on, but are we planning for it? I don't think so.
I would now invite you for a final round of comments, also giving a kind of summary of what your take is of our debate of today.
I mean, just briefly on the questions, economic growth, absolutely. Maybe I'm naive, but I would. How is innovation and being on the forefront of green technology? How is that not good for the economy? I would be surprised if it isn't, but there might be studies. And again, I'm not an economist. But just look at China and EVs and the market capacity and yeah, I think that is the case. Critical minerals, absolutely a security issue and really difficult. Remember, we're talking Greenland, but remember Ukraine, right? That was a thing like half a year ago or something with Trump. It's a really fundamental thing. It's a security issue. Some of the key minerals, we have the relation with China. That is one geopolitical security relationship. Then some of the minerals are, especially in cases like the Democratic Republic in Congo, that's not a place you can access, or as a European company, you would be able to get resources from, or you shouldn't. So it's a really difficult space, but it goes back to the synergies. Like, we need to come to a space and we need to facilitate investment that is de-risking some of those spaces, and that's actually an opportunity, right? I mean, I'm a peace researcher, so I'm the optimist, maybe, but it needs to be an opportunity, and that's maybe then also in closing is we can look at these challenges, and they are, as you said, they're complex, they're complicated, and there are no easy answers, but we can look at them as a dilemma we're not going to solve, as a security challenge that is inevitable, or we can take them as motivation, as an opportunity for cooperation, to come together and try to solve them. And I think that choice we should make, and then we have the opportunity.